The day I found that secret room, I thought I was losing my mind. After living in this house for 43 years, raising 3 children within these walls, I discovered there was an entire part of my home I never knew existed. But what I found inside wasn't just a forgotten storage space. It was a treasure trove of family secrets that would shatter everything my children thought they knew about their inheritance, their grandfather, and the real reason I'd never let them renovate the basement. It started on a rainy Thursday morning in October. My youngest, David, had been pestering me for months about updating the old basement. "Mom, it's 2023. You can't keep living with that ancient paneling and those creaky stairs. Let me at least install some proper lighting down there." But I'd always found excuses. The cost, the disruption, my age. I was 71 after all. What I never told him was that something about that basement had always felt different to me. Like there were mysteries down there I wasn't ready to face. That particular morning, I'd gone downstairs to check on a water leak David had mentioned. The autumn storms had been fierce, and I was worried about flooding. As I examined the far wall where the old wood paneling seemed to bulge slightly, I pressed against it to test for water damage. That's when I heard it. A hollow sound that didn't match the solid thud I expected from the wall behind. My heart started racing as I ran my hands along the panel. There was a slight gap at the bottom, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I grabbed a flashlight from my utility box and knelt down, my 71-year-old knees protesting every movement. When I shined the light along the baseboard, I could see that this particular section of paneling wasn't attached the same way as the others. I found a screwdriver and carefully pried at the edge. The entire panel shifted, revealing hinges I'd never noticed. It was a door. A hidden door in the house I'd lived in for over 4 decades. My hands were trembling as I pulled it open, the old hinges groaning in protest. The beam of my flashlight revealed a small room, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a low ceiling that I had to duck slightly to enter. The air inside was stale but dry, and as my eyes adjusted, I realized this space was filled with furniture, boxes, and what looked like documents carefully stored in plastic containers. Someone had taken great care to preserve whatever was hidden in here. But the real shock came when I saw the desk against the far wall. It was my father's desk, the one my mother had always claimed was lost in a fire before I was born. Sitting on top of it was a leather journal, and beside that, a wooden box I recognized from childhood photographs. My father had died when I was just 12, and my mother had always been vague about his business dealings, claiming he'd been a simple factory worker who'd left us nothing but debts. The room I was standing in told a very different story. I grew up believing my family had always struggled financially. My mother, Ruth, had raised me alone after my father's death, working double shifts at the local diner and constantly worrying about making ends meet. She'd scrimped and saved to buy this house when I was 16, and I'd always admired her determination to give us a stable home despite our modest means. When I married my husband Robert in 1978, we moved in with her to help with the mortgage, and after she passed away in 1995, Robert and I inherited the house. We raised our 3 children here, Sarah, Michael, and David, always grateful for the foundation my mother had provided despite our humble beginnings. But as I stood in that hidden room, surrounded by evidence that contradicted everything I'd been told about my father, I realized my entire understanding of my family history had been built on lies. The leather journal was filled with my father's handwriting, documenting what appeared to be a successful import business he'd run in the 1960s and early 1970s. Page after page detailed transactions, partnerships, and what looked like substantial profits. But more shocking were the entries from the months before his death, where he wrote about his concerns that someone was trying to sabotage his business and his decision to liquidate his assets to protect Ruth and Margaret from whatever's coming. I sank into the desk chair, my hands shaking as I read entry after entry that painted a picture of a man who was nothing like the struggling factory worker my mother had described. According to his own words, my father had been preparing to disappear, to fake his death if necessary, to protect his family from business associates who had threatened us. But the final entry suggested he'd decided on a different plan. He would actually die, but first he would hide his assets where my mother could find them after the danger had passed. The wooden box contained documents that took my breath away. Deed transfers, stock certificates, and bank account information for assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that should have been ours, money that my mother apparently knew about but never accessed. There were instructions in my father's handwriting, explaining how my mother could safely claim these assets once enough time had passed and the dangerous associates had moved on. But the most shocking discovery was a letter addressed to me, written in my mother's handwriting and dated just 3 months before her death in 1995. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you're reading this, then you've found your father's room. I pray you'll forgive me for the lies I told you about him, but I was so afraid. After he died, those men came around asking questions, and I was terrified they'd hurt you if they knew about the money. I decided it was safer to let everyone believe we had nothing, including you. But you deserve to know the truth about your father's love for us, and you deserve the security he tried to provide." The letter went on to explain that my father had indeed faked his own death with help from a doctor friend, planning to disappear until the business threats ended. But he'd had a real heart attack during the staged death, and what was supposed to be a temporary deception became permanent. My mother had been too frightened to access the hidden assets, too worried that doing so would bring the dangerous men back into our lives. "I kept the room sealed," she wrote, "but I always planned to tell you when you were older, when enough time had passed. But years turned into decades, and it became easier to maintain the lie than to admit I'd kept your father's legacy from you. The accounts are still there, Margaret. The investments have been growing all these years. You were never poor, my darling. I just made sure you felt poor to keep you safe." I sat in that hidden room for 3 hours, reading document after document, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The stock certificates alone appeared to be worth well over $1 million, considering the growth over the decades. There were property deeds to rental buildings I'd never known existed, and bank accounts that had been quietly accumulating interest for 50 years. But beyond the financial shock was the emotional revelation. My entire adult life had been shaped by the belief that I came from modest means, that I needed to be grateful for every small blessing, that asking for help or dreaming too big was dangerous presumption. I'd raised my children with those same values, teaching them to work hard and expect little, to be practical rather than ambitious. Meanwhile, hidden in the basement of our family home, there had been enough money to send all 3 of my children to any college they wanted, to help them buy homes, to ensure that none of us ever had to worry about financial security again. The irony was devastating. Just last month, my daughter Sarah had been talking about taking a second job to help pay for her son's college tuition. My middle child, Michael, had been struggling with his small business, and I'd watched him stress about a loan he couldn't qualify for. And David, my youngest, had been putting off starting a family because he and his wife couldn't afford a larger apartment. All of them working so hard, all of us living so carefully, when there had been generational wealth sitting 20 feet beneath our kitchen table. That evening, I called all 3 of my children and asked them to come over for dinner the next day. I told them I had something important to discuss about the house and their inheritance. I could hear the concern in their voices. At 71, any talk of inheritance makes adult children nervous. Sarah asked if I was feeling okay, if I'd been to the doctor recently. Michael wanted to know if I was having financial problems. David immediately offered to take time off work if I needed help with anything. Their love and concern only made what I discovered more poignant. These were good people, people I'd raised to be self-reliant and hardworking, people who had succeeded despite what they believed were modest family resources. How would they react when they learned that the financial struggles they'd watched me navigate, the careful budgeting and practical decisions that had shaped their entire upbringing, had been unnecessary? That night, I went back down to the hidden room and photographed everything. The documents, the journal entries, the letter from my mother. I wanted to be able to prove to my children that I wasn't having some kind of elderly delusion or breakdown. This was real, and it was going to change everything they thought they knew about our family. I also spent time reading more of my father's journal, trying to understand the man who had been erased from my memory by my mother's well-intentioned deceptions. He wrote about his love for his family, his dreams for my future, his hopes that someday I would understand why he had made such drastic choices to protect us. He wrote about wanting me to have opportunities he'd never had, to travel and learn and never be afraid of taking risks because I'd always have security to fall back on. Reading his words, I realized that my mother's decision to hide his legacy hadn't just concealed money. It had concealed an entire philosophy about how our family was supposed to live. Where my father had wanted us to feel empowered and secure, My mother's fear had taught us to feel vulnerable and cautious. The next evening, as my 3 children gathered around the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, I looked at their faces and wondered how to begin. Sarah, 45 and always the responsible oldest child, had brought a notebook, assuming this was going to be a conversation about my final wishes and estate planning. Michael, 42, kept checking his phone, probably worried about the business crisis he'd been managing. David, 38, had that patient but slightly anxious expression he got whenever he thought his aging mother was about to make his life more complicated. I started with the basics. Yesterday morning, I found something in the basement that I think you all need to see. I watched their faces as I explained about the hidden room, about the door behind the paneling that I discovered purely by accident. David looked skeptical. He'd been in that basement hundreds of times over the years. Sarah wanted to know if I'd hurt myself crawling around in old spaces. Michael asked if I'd found evidence of structural damage that we needed to address. None of them were prepared for what I said next. Your grandfather didn't die poor, I told them. And neither did your grandmother. Everything we believed about our family's financial history was a lie your grandmother told to protect us from people who might have hurt us if they'd known the truth. I led them downstairs and showed them the hidden room. I'll never forget the expressions on their faces as they stepped through that concealed door and saw the desk, the documents, the carefully preserved evidence of a family legacy we'd never known existed. David was the first to speak. Mom, how is this possible? How did you live in this house for 43 years without knowing this room existed? Sarah was examining the stock certificates with the focused intensity she brought to her job as an accountant. These are real, she said quietly. Mom, some of these companies, if these certificates are legitimate, they could be worth over $1 million, I finished for her. Probably closer to $2 million, considering the growth over 50 years. Michael had found my father's journal and was reading the entries about the business threats. This says Grandpa was afraid someone was going to hurt you and Grandma. That's why he hid everything. That's why Grandma never told you about it. I showed them my mother's letter, watching as they passed it between them, each reading it with increasing amazement. The silence in that small room was profound as they absorbed the implications of what they were learning. Finally, Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Mom, do you realize what this means? We've all been living like we had to scrape by, and this whole time there was enough money to pay for your college without loans, I said. To help Michael start his business without him risking everything. To let David and Jennifer buy a house instead of renting that tiny apartment. David sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. I don't understand why Grandma never told you. Especially after all those years. I mean, whatever danger Grandpa was worried about, it would have been long gone by the time we were kids. I've been thinking about that question all night. I think she was trapped by her own deception, I said. Every year that passed, it became harder to admit she'd been lying. And maybe she was so used to being afraid that she couldn't imagine it was safe to stop being afraid. Michael was still reading the journal. Listen to this entry from 1971. I want Margaret to go to college, to travel, to never be afraid to take chances because she knows she has security. I want her to marry for love, not financial necessity. I want her to raise confident children who believe they deserve good things. Mom, this man wanted the exact opposite of how you raised us. That hit me harder than I expected. I had married Robert partly because he was stable and reliable, not because I was swept away by passion. I had encouraged my children to be practical in their career choices, to always have backup plans, to never take financial risks. I had taught them that modest expectations were virtuous and that dreaming too big was dangerous. My father had wanted me to be bold, and instead I taught my children to be careful. Sarah was crying now. Not from sadness but from what looked like overwhelming relief. Mom, Jenny's been talking about quitting college because we can't afford the tuition increases. Tom's been working 60-hour weeks trying to keep up with the payments. If this money is real, if it's really ours. It's real, I said. I've been researching it all day. The bank accounts are still active, though they've been dormant for decades. The stock certificates are legitimate. The property deeds are valid. This is our money, kids. It always was. David stood up and walked to the corner of the room, where he'd found a box of photographs I hadn't noticed earlier. "Look at these," he said, holding up pictures of my father that I'd never seen before. In them he was dressed in nice suits, standing in front of what looked like office buildings, shaking hands with well-dressed business partners. These weren't pictures of a factory worker struggling to make ends meet. These were pictures of a successful businessman who'd been documenting his achievements. "He looks proud," Michael observed. "And happy. This doesn't look like a man who was worried about paying the bills." I took the photographs from David, studying the face of the father I'd barely remembered. In my childhood memories he was always tired, always worried. But in these pictures he looked confident and prosperous. I realized that my memories of him had been filtered through my mother's anxiety about money, colored by the story she told me about our supposed poverty. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. She was holding a manila envelope that had been tucked behind the journal. "There are recent documents in here, Mom. Bank statements from this year. These accounts have been generating statements and sending them to a P.O. box that somebody's been maintaining." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside were quarterly investment statements showing account values that made my knees weak. The numbers were bigger than I'd imagined, much bigger. But more surprising was the evidence that someone had been monitoring these accounts, ensuring they remained active and properly managed. "There's a letter from a law firm here," Michael said, reading over my shoulder. "It's addressed to the estate of Ruth Patterson, and it's dated 6 months ago. Mom, I think somebody's been waiting for us to find this room." The letter was from a legal firm in the city, explaining that they had been retained by my mother in 1994, a year before her death, to monitor the dormant accounts and ensure they were properly maintained for eventual discovery by her heirs. According to the letter, they had been sending annual updates to a P.O. box, waiting for someone from the family to make contact about accessing the hidden assets. "She planned this," I said, feeling a mixture of admiration and frustration with my mother's elaborate deception. "She set up systems to preserve everything, but she never quite had the courage to tell me directly." David found another envelope addressed to me specifically, with "to be opened when Margaret finds the room" written in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a more detailed explanation of the accounts, the legal arrangements she'd made, and step-by-step instructions for claiming our inheritance. "Your father's business was completely legitimate," she'd written, "but he got involved with some partners who weren't honest. When he realized they were using his import connections for illegal activities, he tried to extract himself from the business. That's when they threatened our family. Everything he did after that was to protect us while making sure you'd eventually have access to the wealth he'd legitimately earned." The letter included contact information for the law firm, and a detailed explanation of how she'd structured everything to avoid tax problems when we eventually claimed the inheritance. She'd thought of everything except the emotional cost of decades of unnecessary financial anxiety. As we sat in that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of a family legacy we'd never known existed, I watched my children processing the same mix of emotions I'd been struggling with for the past 24 hours. Relief that financial worries could be resolved, anger that we'd suffered unnecessarily, confusion about why their grandmother had maintained such an elaborate deception for so long. But mostly I saw something I'd never seen in their faces before. A sense of possibility, of doors opening instead of closing, of dreams that might actually be achievable. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. I looked around the room one more time, at the desk where my father had planned our security, at the documents that proved his love for us, at the photographs that showed him as the successful man he'd actually been instead of the struggling worker my mother had described. "Now we call that law firm," I said. "We claim what was always ours. And we start living the kind of life your grandfather actually wanted us to have." David was quiet for a long moment before asking, "Mom, are you angry?" "At Grandma, I mean for keeping this from you for your whole adult life." I considered the question carefully. Was I angry? I'd spent decades worrying about money that I'd already inherited. I'd made career choices based on financial necessity that might have been different if I'd known I had security. I'd raised my children to be overly cautious about taking risks or dreaming big dreams. But I'd also raised 3 incredible human beings who knew how to work hard, who appreciated what they had, who cared more about each other than about material possessions. Would they have turned out the same if they'd grown up knowing they were wealthy? "I'm not angry," I said finally. I'm grateful that your grandmother loved us enough to make such a difficult choice, even if I don't agree with how long she maintained it. And I'm grateful that your grandfather loved us enough to make sure we'd be taken care of, even after he was gone. Michael was examining some of the property deeds. Mom, according to these documents, you own 3 rental buildings downtown. You've been a landlord for 50 years without knowing it. That information led to more discoveries. There were property management contracts showing that the buildings had been professionally maintained, and that rental income had been automatically deposited into the investment accounts for decades. My mother hadn't just hidden money from me. She'd hidden an entire real estate empire that had been generating income and appreciating in value for my entire adult life. Sarah was making notes in her accountant's notebook. Mom, based on these statements, you're not just wealthy. You're really wealthy. This isn't comfortable retirement money. This is generational wealth money. Over the next several hours, as we continued exploring the contents of the hidden room, the scope of my father's legacy became clear. He hadn't just been a successful businessman. He'd been a thoughtful investor who'd positioned his assets for long-term growth. The stocks he'd chosen had split multiple times over the decades. The properties he'd bought were now in prime downtown locations. The bonds he'd purchased had matured and been reinvested by the legal firm my mother had retained. But perhaps the most touching discovery was a series of letters my father had written to future grandchildren he would never meet. The letters were sealed and labeled with instructions that they be given to Sarah, Michael, and David when they reached adulthood. Somehow, my mother had never felt comfortable opening them or passing them on. Each letter was personal, written to a specific child based on what my father had imagined their personalities might be like. The letter to Sarah talked about responsibility and leadership, encouraging her to use the family's resources to help others and make a positive impact on the world. The letter to Michael discussed creativity and entrepreneurship, with specific advice about taking calculated risks and following his passions. The letter to David focused on family and relationships, encouraging him to prioritize love and connection over financial achievement. Reading those letters, my children met their grandfather for the first time, learning about his values, his hopes for them, and his belief that wealth was only meaningful if it was used to create opportunities for service and growth. He sounds like he was an amazing man, David said quietly. I wish we could have known him. You do know him, I realized suddenly. Everything good about how you've turned out, the values you have, the way you care about each other and work hard and stay humble, those traits didn't come from nowhere. Your grandmother raised me with his values, even if she was too afraid to share his resources. That insight helped me understand my mother's choices differently. She'd been determined to give me the character lessons my father would have wanted me to have, even while withholding the financial advantages he'd intended. In her mind, maybe she'd been protecting not just our physical safety but our moral development, ensuring that we'd learn to be good people before we learn to be wealthy people. As evening turned into night, we made plans for contacting the law firm and beginning the process of officially claiming our inheritance. But more importantly, we started talking about what we wanted to do with this unexpected opportunity. Sarah immediately wanted to establish college funds for her children and create a scholarship program for kids from working families like she thought she was from. Michael talked about expanding his business and hiring more employees, creating jobs in our community. David wanted to buy a house where he and Jennifer could start the family they'd been postponing for financial reasons. But all 3 of them insisted that the first priority should be improving my life, making sure I was comfortable and secure in my old age, maybe traveling to places I'd always wanted to see but had never felt I could afford. Mom, Sarah said firmly, you've spent your entire adult life worrying about money you already had. You've worked part-time jobs into your 70s because you thought you needed the income. You've lived in this same house for decades because you thought you couldn't afford to move. That ends now. Michael agreed. You raised us to take care of each other. Well, now we have the resources to take care of you the way you deserve. David was more emotional about it. I think about all the times you said no to things because of money. All the vacations we didn't take, all the opportunities you didn't pursue. We can't get those years back, but we can make sure the rest of your life is different. Their generosity and love overwhelmed me, but it also made me realize something important. The values my mother had instilled in me, the lessons about family and responsibility and caring for others, had been passed on to my children successfully. They weren't thinking about what this money could do for them individually. They were thinking about what it could do for all of us together. That night, after my children had gone home to break the news to their own families, I sat alone in the hidden room, trying to process everything that had changed in just 2 days. I was a wealthy woman. I always had been. I was the daughter of a successful businessman who had loved me enough to ensure my security even at the cost of his own life. I was the daughter of a mother who had loved me enough to live in fear for decades to keep me safe. But most importantly, I was the mother of 3 extraordinary adults who had turned out exactly right, who would use their inherited advantages to create more opportunities for others, who understood that wealth was a responsibility as much as it was a blessing. The next morning, I called the law firm my mother had retained all those years ago. The senior partner, James Morrison, had been expecting my call for decades. "Mrs. Patterson," he said warmly, "I've been hoping someone from your family would eventually find Ruth's documentation. We've been managing your father's assets since 1994, and I'm pleased to report that they've grown substantially." The meeting at his office was surreal. Mr. Morrison had known my father personally, and had been involved in helping him hide his assets when the business threats became serious. He confirmed that my father had indeed faked his death initially but had suffered a real heart attack during the staged event, making the deception permanent in a way no one had planned. "Your mother was terrified for years that the dangerous business associates would return," he explained. "She asked me to maintain the accounts and wait for her to feel safe enough to tell you about them. But every year she got more worried that too much time had passed, that you'd be angry about the deception, that it would be too complicated to explain." He showed me detailed records of how the assets had been managed over the decades. Every investment decision had been made with conservative growth in mind, prioritizing long-term stability over quick returns. The result was a portfolio that had weathered multiple economic downturns while steadily increasing in value. "Your father was a very intelligent man," Mr. Morrison said. "He understood that true wealth isn't about accumulating money quickly. It's about building something that can provide security for generations." The total value of the estate was breathtaking. Nearly $3 million in liquid assets, plus the rental properties that generated substantial monthly income. It was enough to transform not just my life, but the lives of my children and grandchildren for generations to come. But Mr. Morrison also shared something that meant more to me than the financial details. He gave me a letter my father had written to be delivered when his assets were finally claimed, a letter that had been waiting in the law firm's files for over 50 years. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then the danger has passed and your mother felt safe enough to share our secret. I want you to know that every choice I made was motivated by my love for you, and my determination that you would have every opportunity life could offer." The letter went on to explain his vision for how the money should be used, not just for security but for education, travel, creativity, and service to others. He wrote about his dreams that I would attend university, that I would see the world, that I would never be afraid to take risks or follow my passions because I would always have a foundation to fall back on. "I also hope," he wrote, "that you will raise your children to understand that privilege comes with responsibility. This money should make your family's life better, but it should also make other people's lives better. Use it to create opportunities to help people who need help, to make the world a little more fair and a little more kind." Reading his words, I understood that my mother's decision to hide the inheritance hadn't just been about physical safety. She'd been worried that sudden wealth might corrupt our family's values, that we might become entitled or careless about money if we hadn't learned to appreciate hard work and modest living first. In an odd way, her 50-year deception had been the ultimate gift. My children and I had learned to be good people without money, which meant we could probably be trusted to be good people with money. Over the following weeks, as we worked with Mr. Morrison to officially transfer all the assets and update the accounts, our family began making plans for this unexpected windfall. But the most important conversations weren't about what we would buy or where we would travel. They were about how we would honor my father's wishes and my mother's values, while creating the kind of life he dreamed we would have. Sarah decided to quit her second job and spend more time with her children, but she also established a foundation to provide college scholarships for students from working families. Michael expanded his business and hired 5 new employees, But he also created profit-sharing programs to ensure his workers would benefit from his success. David and Jennifer bought their house and started planning their family, but they also began volunteering with organizations that helped young couples achieve homeownership. As for me, I finally understood what my father had meant about not being afraid to take risks. At 71, I enrolled in art classes I'd always wanted to take. I booked a trip to Europe that I'd been dreaming about for decades. I hired contractors to renovate the house properly, including that basement where the secret room had hidden for so long. But I also established a fund to help elderly people in our community who were struggling with the same financial anxieties I'd lived with unnecessarily for so many years. I wanted to make sure that other families wouldn't have to choose between security and dreams the way I thought I had to. The hidden room has become something of a family shrine now. We've preserved my father's desk and journal, and we've added photographs and mementos that tell the story of how his love and my mother's sacrifice shaped our family's character. My grandchildren love hearing the story of how their great-grandfather was so clever that he managed to take care of his family even after he died, and how their great-grandmother was so brave that she kept his secret safe for 50 years. But the most important thing we learned from discovering that room wasn't about money at all. It was about the power of love to transcend time, the way good values can survive even when they're hidden, and the truth that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the strength of family bonds and the commitment to use whatever advantages we have to make life better for others. 6 months after I found the secret room, David's wife Jennifer gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. As I held my newest grandchildren and watched my son's face light up with joy that wasn't shadowed by financial worry, I realized that my father's greatest legacy wasn't the money he'd hidden away. It was the security he provided that would allow future generations of our family to make choices based on love and values, rather than fear and necessity. The secret room taught us that sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in years of patience, that love can work even when it's invisible, and that the best family legacies aren't just passed down. They're discovered, honored, and shared with the world. My father wanted me to live boldly, and it only took me 71 years to understand what he meant. But now that I do, I'm making up for lost time. And I'm making sure that his great-grandchildren will grow up knowing they come from a family that believes in dreaming big, working hard, and using their blessings to bless others. The house looks different now, with better lighting and fresh paint and modern conveniences that make daily life easier. But the most important change isn't visible to visitors. It's the feeling in the air, the sense that this is a home where people believe in possibilities, where children are taught that they deserve good things, where love is expressed through empowerment rather than protection from imaginary dangers. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd found that room when I was younger, if my children had grown up knowing about their inheritance, if we'd lived all these years with the security my father had intended us to have. Would we have been different people? Would we have been better people or worse? But then I watch my children making thoughtful decisions about how to use their unexpected wealth, and I see my grandchildren growing up confident and generous, and I realize that maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. Maybe we needed to learn how to be humble before we could learn how to be wealthy. Maybe we needed to understand the value of hard work before we could appreciate the gift of financial freedom. The secret room gave us more than money. It gave us the story of who we really were, the truth about where we came from, and the confidence to believe that we deserved the good things life could offer. Most importantly, it gave us the responsibility to make sure that our unexpected advantages would be used to create more opportunities for others, to honor the love that had preserved those assets for us, and to pass on both the wealth and the values that would make future generations worthy of both. I'm 72 now, and I finally understand what it means to live without fear, to make choices based on possibilities rather than limitations, to believe that taking risks is safe when you know you're loved. My father's secret room didn't just change our bank account balance. It changed our understanding of ourselves, our family, and our responsibility to each other, and to the world. And every time I go down to the basement and see that open door, that space that's no longer hidden, I'm reminded that some secrets are worth keeping until the right moment to reveal them, and that love sometimes works in mysterious ways that take decades to understand but create benefits that last for generations. The room is empty now except for my father's desk and journal, but it's full of possibility, full of the dreams he had for us and the dreams we're finally brave enough to pursue. It's a reminder that home isn't just where we live. It's where we discover who we're meant to become.